Christmas Eve, 2023. 23 family members gathered around my parents' mahogany dining table, the turkey-carved wine-flowing children laughing. Then my father Harold cleared his throat, pointed his carving knife directly at me, and declared to the entire room, "Sean, you're the biggest disgrace to this family." Forks froze mid-bite. My cousin Ashley's phone appeared recording. Aunt Carol gasped. Uncle Tim's jaw dropped. The children stopped giggling. My mother Barbara nodded in cold agreement. 22 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My wine glass trembled in my hand. I set my wine glass down with deliberate precision, the crystal making a soft clink against the polished wood. The silence stretched across the dining room like a taut wire, ready to snap. Harold's carving knife remained pointed in my direction, his face flushed crimson from the burgundy he'd been consuming all evening. "You want to know what makes me such a disgrace, Dad?" I asked, my voice cutting through the uncomfortable quiet. "Is it because I chose to help homeless veterans instead of joining your construction empire because I make $40,000 a year as a social worker instead of the millions you pull in from your developments?" Barbara shifted nervously in her chair, her diamond bracelet catching the candlelight as she reached for her water glass. She'd been expecting this confrontation for months, ever since I'd stopped returning their calls about joining the family business. "You had every opportunity handed to you," Harold snarled, finally lowering the knife. "Private school college paid in full connections that most people would kill for. And you threw it all away to work with degenerates and drug addicts." My cousin Derek, home from Stanford for winter break, leaned forward with obvious discomfort. His younger brother Brandon fidgeted with his napkin, while Ashley continued recording despite her mother's frantic gesturing to put the phone away. "Degenerates and drug addicts?" I repeated, tasting the bitterness of his words. "You mean like Marcus Thompson, the Marine, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan and ended up sleeping under the highway overpass because he couldn't afford his medication? Or maybe you're talking about Linda Rodriguez, the single mother who lost her apartment when her employer cut her hours." Uncle Tim cleared his throat awkwardly. "Sean, maybe this isn't the time or place for this discussion." "No, Uncle Tim, this is exactly the time and place." I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Because what makes me a disgrace isn't my career choice. It's that I discovered exactly how this family built its fortune. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harold's face went from red to pale in seconds. Barbara's hand trembled as she set down her glass wine, sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "I know about the fake construction projects, Dad. The invoices for buildings that were never built. The cash payments to city council members for zoning variances that should never have been approved." I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, swiping through a folder of photographs I'd been collecting for months. Martindale Court, Riverside Gardens, Oakwood Commons, all supposedly low-income housing developments that received federal funding. Funny thing is, when I drove out to visit these locations, all I found were empty lots. Harold pushed back from the table, his chair nearly toppling backward. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" I turned my phone screen toward the family, showing pictures of vacant land where apartment complexes should have stood. $12.7 million in federal grants over the past 5 years, money earmarked for affordable housing that somehow disappeared into offshore accounts. Grandmother Rose, 85 years old and sharp as ever, despite her frail appearance, spoke for the first time all evening. Her voice carried the weight of decades of family disappointment. "Harold, you need to explain these accusations. Mother Sean is delusional. He's been listening to too many conspiracy theories from his bleeding heart friends." But my phone contained more than just empty lots. I swiped to the next folder, revealing photographs of families I'd helped after they'd been illegally evicted from properties my father claimed to be renovating. The Gonzalez family evicted 3 days before Christmas last year. No proper notice, no alternative housing provided. I found them sleeping in their car outside a church. Ashley's phone captured every word, every expression of horror crossing my relatives' faces. Aunt Carol covered her mouth with her hands while Derek and Brandon exchanged glances, filled with dawning comprehension. The Williams family displaced when Dad condemned their building for structural issues that his own inspectors later admitted didn't exist. The Chen family told their lease was invalid due to clerical errors that mysteriously appeared after Dad decided their neighborhood was ready for gentrification. Harold's hands shook as he reached for his bourbon, the ice cubes rattling against the crystal tumbler. "You have no idea what you're talking about, boy. Those families were squatters, criminals, who didn't belong in those neighborhoods anyway." Criminals. My voice rose for the first time all evening. Maria Gonzalez works double shifts at the hospital as a janitor to support her 3 children. David Williams is a retired postal worker who served this community for 30 years. These aren't criminals, Dad. These are the people whose lives you've destroyed for profit. Barbara finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sean, please. This is family time. Can't we discuss this privately?" Family time. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. When exactly would that be, Mom, between the fundraising galas for politicians who vote on your zoning requests? Or maybe during the charity auctions where you bid on art, while the families you displaced spend winter nights in homeless shelters? The children had long since been forgotten, their presence adding an uncomfortable witness to the adult drama unfolding. Little Emma, Derek's 6-year-old sister, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is everyone upset?" Aunt Carol picked up Emma, whispering that they should go play in the living room. But Emma's innocent question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. "You know what the real disgrace is?" I continued, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my chest. "It's that I spent months hoping I was wrong about all of this. I kept telling myself that maybe there was some explanation, some justification for what I was seeing. But there isn't." Harold stood abruptly, his chair flying backward and crashing into the antique china cabinet. Delicate porcelain rattled ominously. "Enough, I will not sit here and listen to my own son spread lies about this family. Everything I built legally and ethically." Then explain the bank records, showing payments to Housing Inspector Richard Coleman 3 days before he approved your Riverside project. Explain the suddenly withdrawn environmental impact report that would have blocked your Millfield development. Explain why every city council meeting where your projects were approved had the same 3 members, absent the ones who'd previously voted against similar proposals. The evidence I'd gathered painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple real estate fraud. It was a network of bribery, intimidation, and manipulation that had operated for years under the guise of legitimate business. Jake, my younger brother, who'd remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, suddenly stood from his chair at the far end of the table. His face was ashen, his investment banker's composure completely shattered. "Sean's telling the truth," he said quietly, his words falling into the dining room like stones into still water. Jake's confession hit the room like a physical blow. Harold spun toward his younger son, confusion and fury warring across his features. Barbara's wine glass slipped from her fingers, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. "What did you just say?" Harold's voice was dangerously quiet. Jake reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. His hands shook as he opened it, revealing bank statements, recorded conversations, and contract copies I'd never seen before. "I've been helping Sean gather evidence for the past 6 months." Jake said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I couldn't watch this anymore, Dad. I couldn't pretend that what we were doing was legitimate business." The folder's contents spilled across the dinner table, scattering between the serving dishes and wine glasses. bank statements showing Harold's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, audio transcripts of Barbara bribing housing inspectors, contracts proving they'd displaced over 200 families in the past 3 years alone. "You little traitor," Harold snarled, lunging toward Jake across the table. Turkey gravy splattered as his elbow knocked over the serving boat. Uncle Tim grabbed Harold's arm, restraining him before he could reach his younger son. "Harold, control yourself," Uncle Tim hissed. "There are children present." But Harold was beyond reason. The carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for decades was crumbling in real time, and his desperation made him reckless. "Everything I did was for this family. Every deal, every connection, every dollar was meant to secure your futures." "I seem to secure our futures by destroying other families," Jake shot back. "I have recordings of you laughing about evicting a pregnant woman 3 days before Christmas. You called it clearing out the trash before the holidays." Barbara collapsed into her chair, hyperventilating. Aunt Carol rushed to her side, loosening her pearl necklace and fanning her with a dinner napkin. The family matriarch who'd ruled social circles with iron determination was reduced to gasping for air as her world imploded. Ashley's live stream had attracted hundreds of viewers, the comment section exploding with shock and outrage as strangers witnessed our family's darkest secrets. Aunt Carol finally noticed the phone and lunged for it, but Ashley danced away, still recording. "This is going viral," Ashley whispered, her eyes wide with the terrible power of social media exposure. "Everyone can see this?" "Jake," I said quietly, "tell them about Mrs. Patterson." My brother's face crumpled with guilt and pain. 3 months ago, I witnessed Dad evicting an elderly woman from her apartment. She was 82 years old, had lived there for 15 years. Her lease was completely valid. But Dad wanted the building for luxury condos. He pulled out his phone, playing a video that made everyone in the room flinch. Harold's voice clear and unmistakable, telling Mrs. Patterson she had 24 hours to vacate or face arrest for trespassing. She begged him. Jake continued, tears streaming down his face. She showed him pictures of her late husband, explained that she couldn't afford to move anywhere else. And you know what Dad said? The room waited in horrified silence. He said, "That's not my problem, lady. Maybe you should have planned better for your old age." Derek and Brandon, both college students who'd idolized their successful uncle, stared in disgust. Their tuition money, their spring break trips, their comfortable lives had been built on the suffering of families like Mrs. Patterson. "I couldn't sleep after that," Jake admitted. "I started going to therapy, trying to process what I'd become part of. My therapist suggested I needed to take action if I wanted to live with myself." Grandmother Rose struggled to remove her jewelry with arthritic fingers, finally managing to place her wedding ring and diamond earrings on the table. "I'm ashamed," she said simply. "Ashamed of what my son has become. Ashamed that I didn't see it sooner. Mother, don't listen to these lies." Harold pleaded, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. "They're not lies," Barbara whispered, finally finding her voice. "I've known for years. I knew, and I said nothing because I was afraid of losing everything." The admission silenced even Harold. His wife's complicity in their crimes was the final nail in the coffin of any moral justification he might have offered. "Afraid of losing what?" I demanded. "The house, the cars, the reputation." "What about the families who lost everything because of your silence?" "You don't understand," Barbara sobbed. "Your father threatened to destroy me if I ever spoke up. He said he'd make sure I never saw my children again, that he'd ruin my family's reputation." This revelation added another layer to the corruption. Not only had Harold built his empire through fraud and intimidation, but he'd maintained control through domestic psychological abuse. Uncle Tim released Harold's arm and stepped backward, his face pale with realization. "The Henderson Project," he said slowly. "You told me that deal fell through because of environmental concerns. but I invested $200,000 based on your assurances. Tim, I can explain that. Harold started, but his brother-in-law cut him off. No explanations. I want my money back, Harold, all of it, with interest. The financial implications were starting to dawn on the extended family. How many of them had investments tied to Harold's fraudulent schemes? How many were unknowingly complicit in his crimes? Derek pulled out his phone and began frantically Googling his father's business connections. Brandon did the same. Both young men realizing their comfortable lives might be built on criminal foundations. Dad, Derek said, his voice cracking, didn't you get that loan from Uncle Harold for the house renovation? Aunt Carol's face went white. Their recent kitchen remodel, the new swimming pool, the landscaping project, all financed through Harold's construction company. Money that might have come from displaced families and fraudulent federal grants. The dinner table had become ground zero for the complete destruction of our family's reputation. Christmas decorations that had seemed warm and festive an hour ago now felt grotesquely inappropriate, mocking the pain and betrayal filling the room. Jake gathered his documents, organizing them with the precision that made him successful on Wall Street. There's more, he said quietly. Sean, show them the federal paperwork. My heart pounded as I realized what my brother meant. The final revelation that would transform this family dinner into something far more serious than moral reckoning. I pulled my second phone from my back pocket, the device I'd been using exclusively for communications with federal authorities. The screen displayed a text message thread that would change everything for everyone sitting at this table. Agent Martinez, I said, reading the contact name aloud. Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. The words hit the room like a physical force. Aunt Carol dropped her napkin. Uncle Tim gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. Ashley's live stream audience watched in stunned silence as their casual family drama entertainment transformed into a federal investigation reveal. The investigation has been active for 3 months. I continued scrolling through messages that detailed surveillance operations, asset seizure preparations, and witness interviews. Federal raids are scheduled for December 27th. All of Dad's business accounts will be frozen by New Year's Day. Harold sank into his chair as if his legs had given out. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse sitting at his own wake. You turned in your own family to the feds. I turned in criminals to the authorities, I corrected. The fact that those criminals happen to share my last name is irrelevant. Barbara began hyperventilating again, this time more severely. The reality of federal prison was clearly more terrifying than family shame. Sean, please tell me you can stop this. Tell me there's still time to fix this. Fix what exactly? The 237 families you displaced, the $12.7 million in stolen federal grants, the dozens of city officials you bribed. Which part of this did you want me to help you fix? Uncle Tim's voice was barely audible when he spoke. My investment portfolio. How much of it is connected to Harold's companies? I consulted notes on my phone information I'd gathered during months of cooperation with federal investigators. Approximately 60% of your holdings are tied to entities under federal investigation. Your house, your children's college funds, your retirement accounts, all funded through laundered money. Aunt Carol began crying quietly, the implications crushing her. Their comfortable suburban lifestyle was about to evaporate in a federal asset seizure. However, I continued, federal prosecutors have prepared immunity deals for family members who cooperate with the investigation. Jake has already signed his agreement. The rest of you still have the opportunity to save yourselves through voluntary testimony. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about survival. Every person at this table faced potential criminal liability for their connection to Harold's schemes. Derek and Brandon huddled together, whispering urgently about their trust funds and college expenses. Ashley finally stopped recording the gravity of the situation, overriding her social media instincts. What exactly does cooperation involve? Uncle Tim asked, his business instincts overriding family loyalty. I produced a folder from Agent Martinez, thick with legal documents and cooperation agreements. Full disclosure of any knowledge regarding financial irregularities, bribery, or fraudulent practices. Testimony before federal grand juries. Assistance in asset recovery for victim compensation. Harold tried one desperate gambit to maintain control. He lunged for the legal documents, attempting to destroy them before anyone could read the details. But Jake intercepted him, and the two men grappled over the papers. Everything is digitally backed up in multiple secure locations. I announced, stopping the struggle. Destroying physical copies accomplishes nothing except adding obstruction of justice to the charges you're already facing. Harold released the documents and slumped against the wall, defeated. The fight had gone out of him completely. 20 years of criminal enterprise was collapsing in a single evening. Barbara broke down completely, her sobs echoing through the dining room. "I'm sorry," she whispered over and over. "I'm so sorry to all those families. I knew it was wrong, but I was too afraid to stop it." Her confession was crucial for prosecution, but it also represented the first genuine remorse anyone in the family had expressed. The human cost of their crimes was finally penetrating the wall of justification and denial they'd built. Grandmother Rose struggled to her feet, supporting herself on her walker. At 85, she commanded respect even in the midst of family chaos. "Harold, look at me." Her son raised his head reluctantly, shame and fear written across his features. "I raised you better than this," she said simply. "Your father built this family's reputation through honest work and community service. How could you destroy everything he stood for?" The real estate market changed, Mother. Competition became cutthroat. Everyone was cutting corners to survive. Everyone was not bribing officials and stealing federal funds, she replied sharply. Everyone was not evicting elderly women to build luxury condos. You made choices, Harold. Evil choices. She turned toward me with obvious effort, her aged eyes filled with pride and sadness. "Sean, you did the right thing. It took courage to stand up to family, to choose justice over loyalty. Your grandfather would be proud." The contrast between generations was stark. Grandmother Rose, raised during the Depression with values of integrity and community service. Harold, corrupted by decades of easy money and minimal oversight. And now Sean and Jake, forced to choose between family loyalty and moral responsibility. Agent Martinez's messages continued arriving throughout our conversation. Asset seizure teams were positioning for coordinated raids across 3 states. Harold's empire would be dismantled systematically, every property examined, every transaction traced. The federal government is particularly interested in the Riverside Gardens project. I read from my phone. 50 families were displaced for a development that received $8.2 million in federal housing grants but was never built. The money disappeared into shell companies controlled by your offshore accounts. Harold's crimes weren't victimless financial manipulations. They had real human consequences. Families destroyed, communities disrupted, public trust betrayed. The weight of that suffering was finally settling on everyone present. Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I can't be here for this. This is insane. My uncle is going to federal prison, my cousins are FBI informants, and my college fund is stolen money." "Welcome to reality," Jake said quietly. "This is what our family actually is underneath all the wealth and respectability." Brandon remained seated, but pulled out his phone, presumably calling friends to process the situation. Their generation had grown up assuming their privilege was legitimate, never questioning the source of their comfortable lives. Ashley approached me hesitantly, holding her phone. "Sean, should I delete the video? This is going to ruin everyone." The question highlighted the moral complexity of our situation. Exposure would bring accountability, but also destroy innocent family members who'd been manipulated and lied to for years. Keep the video, I decided. Truth has consequences, but hiding truth has worse consequences. The family's dad displaced deserved to see justice even if it's painful for us. Christmas dinner was completely forgotten now. Food grew cold, while legal documents spread across the table like evidence in a courtroom. The holiday celebration had transformed into a reckoning that would reshape every relationship in our family. But the evening's revelations weren't finished yet. Harold still had one final card to play, one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation that was spiraling beyond his influence. Harold pushed himself away from the wall where he'd been slumping in defeat. His eyes had regained a dangerous glitter, the look of a cornered animal preparing for one final vicious strike. I recognized that expression from childhood, the moment before he'd unleash punishment that would leave lasting scars. "You want to destroy this family, Sean." His voice carried a cold menace that made everyone in the room freeze. "Let me tell you exactly who you're protecting with your righteous crusade." He disappeared into his study, returning moments later with a manila envelope that looked decades old. The edges were yellowed with age, and his hands trembled as he opened the clasp. "Sean Michael Patterson," he announced, reading from documents I'd never seen before. "Born in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina on March 15, 1995. Parents killed during ethnic cleansing operations. Brought to the United States as a war refugee at age 4. The words hit me like physical blows. My entire understanding of my identity began crumbling as Harold continued reading from adoption papers I never knew existed. Naturalization documents filed with irregularities that could be challenged by immigration authorities. Social Security number issued based on falsified birth certificate. Legal name change processed without proper documentation of original identity. Barbara remained silent, her complicity in this final manipulation evident in her refusal to meet my eyes. She'd known about my adoption, about the questionable legal status, and had kept it secret for 24 years. Every credential you have, every license, every legal document in your name could be invalidated if immigration authorities discover the irregularities in your naturalization process. Harold continued his confidence returning as he wielded this ultimate weapon. Your social work license would be revoked immediately. You'd become a stateless refugee again. The room went completely silent. Jake's face had gone pale with shock. Grandmother Rose gripped her walker so tightly I thought she might fall. Even Ashley lowered her phone, too stunned to continue recording. "You owe everything to this family." Harold pressed his advantage. "Your education, your opportunities, your very existence in this country depends on documents we provided and connections we maintained. Without us, you're nothing but an orphaned immigrant who doesn't belong anywhere." The psychological manipulation was masterful and devastating. Harold had waited decades to use this information, saving it for the moment when he needed ultimate leverage over me. Every family argument, every disagreement about values, every moral stand I'd taken could be neutralized with the threat of deportation. "I have the original documents right here," he said, fanning out papers that supposedly proved my precarious legal status. "One phone call to the right people, and your American citizenship disappears. You'll be deported to a country you don't remember, where you have no connections, no resources, no future." Jake found his voice first. "Dad, you can't do this. Sean is your son regardless of biology. You raised him, you claimed him, you can't threaten him with deportation." "He's not my son," Harold snarled. "He's an ungrateful refugee who bit the hand that fed him. Blood tells, and his blood is that of foreign criminals who died in a war that had nothing to do with America." The cruelty was breathtaking. Harold was willing to destroy someone he'd claimed to love for 24 years rather than accept responsibility for his crimes. The racism underlying his threats made them even more vicious. Aunt Carol stood abruptly, her face flushed with outrage. "Harold, you're talking about your child? How can you say such horrible things?" "He's not my child," Harold repeated. "He's a charity case who turned against the family that saved him from poverty and war. He deserves whatever consequences come from that betrayal." Uncle Tim shook his head in disgust. "This is monstrous, Harold. Even if everything you're saying is true, threatening deportation makes you no better than the worst kind of criminal." But Harold wasn't finished. He produced another folder, this one containing what appeared to be business documents. "Your precious displaced families aren't the innocent victims you think they are, Sean. The Gonzalez family you're so worried about, Maria Gonzalez, was working under a false social security number. The Williams family, David Williams, had outstanding warrants for tax evasion in 2 states. The implication was clear. Harold had researched every family I'd helped looking for criminal violations or immigration irregularities he could use to justify their displacement. His corruption wasn't just financial, it was a systematic campaign of intimidation against vulnerable populations. "Even if that were true," I said quietly, "immigration violations don't justify fraud, bribery, and theft. You stole federal money intended for housing assistance and used it to build your personal fortune. I provided jobs, economic development, tax revenue for the community. Those families contributed nothing but crime and social problems." The racism was becoming more explicit with each sentence. Harold's worldview was built on a foundation of ethnic superiority and economic social Darwinism that justified any cruelty toward people he considered inferior. Derek and Brandon exchanged horrified glances. Their successful, respectable uncle was revealing himself to be a white supremacist who'd hidden his bigotry behind business success and charitable donations. "I'm offering you a deal." Harold continued his voice, taking on the tone of a businessman proposing a transaction. "Abandon your cooperation with federal authorities. Return to the family business where you belong. Help us rebuild what you've damaged with your naive idealism. Do that, and your adoption documents remain sealed forever." The ultimatum was clear: family loyalty and criminal complicity in exchange for protection from deportation. Moral compromise to maintain my legal existence in the only country I'd ever known. Barbara finally spoke, her voice pleading. "Sean, please consider what your father is offering. We can be a family again if you just let this go. Think about your future, your career, your life here." "Think about the families you displaced," I replied. "Think about Mrs. Patterson evicted at 82 years old. Think about the pregnant woman Jake mentioned thrown out 3 days before Christmas. Think about all the children who went homeless because of your greed." "Those people don't matter," Harold said bluntly. "They're not family. You are. Or at least you were until you chose to betray us." Grandmother Rose had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. Now she struggled to speak, her voice shaking with emotion and age. "Harold, I knew about Sean's adoption. I've known since the day you brought him home." The room went silent again. Harold's ultimate weapon was being defused by the family matriarch, whose opinion carried more weight than anyone else's. "Okay, the adoption was completely legal." She continued slowly. "I reviewed every document with my lawyer to make sure everything was proper. Sean's citizenship has never been in question." She turned toward Harold with contempt that was devastating to witness. "Those papers you're waving around are forgeries you had created years ago as insurance against Sean's independence. I've seen them before when you threatened to use them during high school when he refused to cheat on his SATs." The revelation shattered Harold's final manipulation attempt. His supposed evidence of my questionable legal status was just another layer of his criminal behavior, more fraudulent documents created to maintain family control. Jake stood and moved to my side, his solidarity unmistakable. "Sean is my brother, regardless of where he was born. If you want to threaten him with deportation, You'll have to go through me first." Derek and Brandon nodded their agreement. Even Ashley stepped forward, her generation's instinctive rejection of racism overriding family loyalty. "Uncle Harold, what you're saying is disgusting," Ashley said quietly. "Sean is family, period. End of discussion." Harold's last desperate gambit had failed completely. Instead of dividing the family and regaining control, his threats had united everyone against him. The racism and manipulation that had been hidden beneath his respectable facade was finally exposed. But the evening's drama still had one more shocking twist that no one could have anticipated. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:37, its chimes echoing through the house, with an ominous finality. Harold's face went ashen as he realized what the sound meant. Federal agents don't observe normal business hours, especially when dealing with flight risks and evidence destruction. Agent Martinez entered our dining room flanked by 6 federal officers, their badges clearly visible and warrant papers ready for presentation. The Christmas dinner that had devolved into family tribunal was about to become the scene of an active arrest. "Mr. Harold Patterson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, bribery of public officials, and tax evasion." Agent Martinez announced, producing handcuffs that glinted under the chandelier light. "You have the right to remain silent." But Harold's arrest wasn't the shocking revelation. Agent Martinez turned toward me with a slight smile, holding up a tablet displaying digital records I'd never seen before. "Mr. Sean Patterson, your citizenship status has never been in question. The adoption proceedings were completely legitimate, processed through proper legal channels with full documentation. The papers your father has been threatening you with are forgeries created in 2018 as part of a systematic campaign of family intimidation." The agent's words continued as Harold was handcuffed, his criminal empire finally crumbling in the most public way possible. "We've been investigating Mr. Patterson's history of psychological manipulation and document forgery for several months. You weren't his only victim, Sean. Your father used similar tactics against business partners, employees, and even your mother." Barbara broke down completely at this revelation. 24 years of marriage to a man who'd held fabricated deportation threats over their adopted son's head. 24 years of living in fear of his manipulative control. The offshore accounts contain detailed records of payments to private investigators hired to research family members' vulnerabilities. Agent Martinez continued reading from his tablet. "Your father maintained files on everyone in this room, documenting personal information he could use for blackmail and control." Uncle Tim stepped forward with obvious dread. "What kind of information?" "Financial irregularities, personal relationships, academic records, medical information, legal issues. Mr. Patterson hired private investigators to build psychological profiles on family members looking for pressure points he could exploit." The systematic nature of Harold's manipulation was staggering. This wasn't just financial crime. It was domestic terrorism directed against his own family. Every person at this table had been surveilled, researched, and psychologically profiled for potential exploitation. Derek's voice cracked when he spoke. "The scholarship rejection letters from Duke. When I applied for early admission and got rejected even though my grades were perfect. Did Uncle Harold sabotage that?" Agent Martinez consulted his records. Private investigator reports show contact with Duke admissions office, warning them about fabricated disciplinary issues in your academic record. Your application was withdrawn based on false information your uncle provided. The scope of Harold's control became clear. He hadn't just stolen money. He'd manipulated family members' entire lives to maintain his position of power. College applications, sabotaged job opportunities, blocked relationships, interfered with all to ensure family dependence. Ashley approached Agent Martinez hesitantly. "My boyfriend Marcus, the one who broke up with me last spring. He said he'd learned things about my family that made him uncomfortable." Private investigator contacted your boyfriend's family with allegations about your father's business practices and your family's alleged criminal connections. The information was designed to destroy the relationship and isolate you from outside influences. Harold's manipulation had reached into every aspect of our lives. No relationship was safe from his interference, no opportunity free from his sabotage. The psychological damage would take years to fully understand and overcome. But Agent Martinez had more revelations that would transform our understanding of the evening's events. Wow, see, Sean, your cooperation with our investigation wasn't just about financial crimes. When you first contacted us 6 months ago, you mentioned concerns about domestic abuse and family intimidation. That led us to investigate your father's history of psychological manipulation. Jake stepped forward with obvious relief. I wasn't the only one feeding information to the FBI. Your cooperation was crucial, Jake, but Sean's initial contact opened a broader investigation into organized criminal activity. The financial crimes were just one component of a systematic criminal enterprise that included bribery, extortion document forgery, and domestic terrorism. Agent Martinez opened a briefcase containing evidence that made everyone in the room gasp. Hidden cameras, recording devices, surveillance equipment that had been secretly installed throughout Harold's properties. We've been monitoring Mr. Patterson's activities for 3 months, documenting his attempts to intimidate family members and destroy evidence. Every threat he made tonight was recorded. Every admission of guilt was preserved for prosecution. The revelation explained why federal agents had arrived so quickly. They'd been listening to our entire Christmas dinner conversation, waiting for Harold to incriminate himself completely before moving to arrest. The deportation threats against Sean constitute federal crimes under immigration intimidation statutes. The forged documents represent multiple felony charges. The surveillance and blackmail activities violate domestic terrorism laws. Harold's criminal liability was expanding beyond financial fraud into far more serious federal charges that carried decades in prison. His desperation tonight had been his final mistake. Barbara approached Agent Martinez with obvious shame. I've been complicit in many of these activities. I knew about the surveillance, the threats, the manipulation. What happens to me? Your cooperation tonight and your willingness to testify about domestic abuse will be considered during sentencing. Federal prosecutors are prepared to offer reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation and victim restitution. The agent produced another folder thick with victim impact statements that made everyone in the room fall silent. 237 families were displaced by your husband's fraudulent activities. Many of them have written statements describing the impact on their lives, their children's education, their emotional trauma. He began reading excerpts that brought tears to eyes throughout the room. Maria Santos describing her premature labor brought on by eviction stress, David Chen's elderly father developing depression after losing his lifetime home, children forced to change schools repeatedly as their families searched for affordable housing. However, many of these same families have also written statements praising Sean's assistance during their displacement. His work helped document their situations, provided resources for temporary housing, and connected them with legal aid. The irony was profound. While Harold had destroyed families for profit, I'd unknowingly been building the case against him by helping his victims. My social work hadn't just been charity. It had been gathering evidence for federal prosecution. Sean's victim assistance work led us to discover the broader pattern of fraud and manipulation. Without his documentation of displacement activities, we might never have connected individual cases to systematic criminal enterprise. Agent Martinez turned toward the extended family members who'd been watching this drama unfold with growing horror. Uncle Tim, Aunt Carol, Derek, Brandon, Ashley, your cooperation with ongoing investigation will determine your legal status. Family relationship doesn't create criminal liability, but willful ignorance after tonight's revelations could constitute obstruction of justice. The message was clear. Everyone at this table now faced a choice between cooperation and complicity. Remaining loyal to Harold after learning about his crimes would make them accessories after the fact. As Harold was led away in handcuffs, he made one final attempt to maintain family control. "This isn't over. I have lawyers, connections, resources you can't imagine. I'll be out on bail tomorrow and this family will remember where their loyalty belongs." But Agent Martinez had one last revelation that would destroy Harold's confidence completely. "Mr. Patterson, your assets were frozen this afternoon based on evidence of ongoing criminal activity and flight risk. Your lawyers have been notified that retainer payments may constitute money laundering if sourced from fraudulent activities. Your connections are currently under federal investigation for corruption, and your resources are being seized for victim restitution." Harold's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was being systematically dismantled by federal authorities who'd been planning this operation for months. Every bank account, every property, every business connection was under investigation. As the federal agents prepared to leave with their prisoner, Agent Martinez addressed the remaining family members with unexpected compassion. "What happened here tonight took courage from several people. Sean and Jake risked family relationships to expose serious crimes. Barbara chose truth over loyalty after years of abuse. Grandmother Rose refused to enable criminal behavior despite family pressure." He paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "Recovery from this kind of systematic manipulation takes time and professional help. Federal Victim Services can provide resources for family members who've been psychologically abused. The investigation will continue, but tonight represents the beginning of accountability, not just the end of criminal activity." Christmas dinner was finally over, but the real work of healing and reconstruction was just beginning. Agent Martinez lingered after Harold's arrest, his demeanor shifting from official law enforcement to something approaching family counselor. The dining room felt eerily quiet without Harold's dominating presence, as if a thunderstorm had suddenly passed. "Before I leave, there are some people who wanted to speak with you," the agent said, pulling out his phone. "Sean, your work over the past year has had more impact than you realize." He dialed a number and put the call on speaker. A woman's voice filled the room, speaking with a slight accent that carried warmth and gratitude. "Sean, this is Maria Santos. Agent Martinez told me you'd be there tonight." I recognized her name immediately. The pregnant woman Harold had evicted 3 days before Christmas, the one Jake had mentioned witnessing. "Maria, how are you? How's your daughter?" "Isabella is healthy and walking now. She's 15 months old, and she's the reason I wanted to call you tonight." Maria's voice carried emotion that made everyone in the room lean forward to listen. "When your father threw us out, I was 8 months pregnant and terrified. You helped us find emergency shelter, drove me to the hospital when labor started, even bought Isabella's first car seat with your own money." Barbara gasped quietly, tears streaming down her face as she heard about kindnesses she never knew her adopted son had performed. "But that's not why I called," Maria continued. "I wanted you to know that I've been documenting everything that happened to us. Photos, receipts, medical records, correspondence with your father's company. Agent Martinez says my records helped prove the pattern of illegal evictions." Agent Martinez nodded approvingly. Maria's documentation was crucial evidence in building the federal case. She wasn't just a victim, she became a witness who helped protect other families. Another voice joined the call, this one belonging to an elderly man who spoke with careful precision. "Sean, this is David Chen. My family lost our home to your father's fraudulent foreclosure last September." "Mr. Chen, I remember. You'd lived there for 22 years. The memory of his devastation still haunted me. An entire lifetime of memories, packed into boxes and loaded into a rented truck. You helped my father find senior housing when we had nowhere to go. But more importantly, you helped me understand that what happened to us was illegal. You gave me the courage to document everything and report it to authorities." Agent Martinez consulted his notes. Mr. Chen's father provided testimony about systematic targeting of elderly tenants who were less likely to fight eviction proceedings. His evidence helped prove age discrimination charges. The scope of community support was becoming clear. The families I'd helped weren't just grateful recipients of social services. They'd become active participants in bringing Harold to justice. There are 23 families total who want you to know their stories became part of the federal investigation, Agent Martinez explained. Your work didn't just provide temporary assistance, it built the foundation for systematic prosecution of housing crimes. Barbara approached the phone with obvious shame. Maria, Mr. Chen, this is Barbara Sean's mother. I need you to know how sorry I am for what my husband did to your families. I knew it was wrong, but I was too afraid to stop it. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Maria responded. Mrs. Patterson, fear is something we all understand. The important thing is what you choose to do now, that you're no longer afraid. I want to help, Barbara said quietly. Whatever restitution is possible, whatever testimony is needed, whatever it takes to help repair the damage Harold caused. David Chen's voice carried surprising warmth when he replied, Mrs. Patterson, accountability and repair are different things. Accountability is what the courts will handle. Repair is what families and communities do together. Agent Martinez ended the call and produced another folder, this one, containing victim impact statements that painted a picture of community resilience in the face of systematic abuse. Federal sentencing guidelines require consideration of victim impact, but they also consider family impact and community benefit, he explained. Harold faces 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Barbara's cooperation and commitment to restitution will likely result in community service and financial penalties rather than incarceration. The relief on Barbara's face was palpable. The prospect of rebuilding her life rather than spending it in prison gave her the first hope she'd felt in months. What about the rest of the family? Uncle Tim asked, clearly worried about his financial exposure and potential legal liability. Family members who were unaware of criminal activities face no charges, but you'll need to cooperate with asset recovery efforts to help fund victim restitution. Some investments will be lost, but most family members will retain personal assets unconnected to criminal proceeds. Agent Martinez turned to Derek and Brandon, both college students whose futures had been thrown into uncertainty. Your tuition accounts will be reviewed to determine the source of funding. Money derived from criminal activities will be seized, but you'll have opportunities to complete your education through legitimate financial aid. The practical implications were severe, but not devastating. Lives would be disrupted, lifestyles would change, but the extended family could survive and rebuild on legitimate foundations. What happens to Harold's business partners and employees? Jake asked clearly, thinking about people whose livelihoods depended on the construction company. Legitimate employees will be protected through federal assistance programs. Business partners who were unaware of criminal activities will have opportunities to reorganize under new management. The construction company itself will be dissolved, but the workforce and legitimate contracts can be preserved. Grandmother Rose, who'd been quietly listening to these practical discussions, finally spoke up. Agent Martinez, what about the properties where families were illegally evicted? Can they be returned to their original residence? In many cases, yes. Federal asset forfeiture allows seized properties to be used for victim restitution. Families who were illegally displaced will have first priority for housing assistance using Harold's forfeited real estate. The poetic justice was satisfying. Harold's victims would be housed in properties he'd stolen from them. His criminal profits would fund their recovery and relocation. Ashley approached Agent Martinez, with her phone looking uncertain about her evening's recording activities. I live-streamed part of tonight's conversation before I realized how serious it was. Should I delete the video? Social media exposure of criminal activities isn't illegal, but you should consider the privacy and safety of family members who weren't involved in criminal behavior. The agent replied diplomatically. Public accountability and family healing can sometimes conflict. Ashley nodded thoughtfully. I'll edit out anything that might hurt innocent people, but I think Harold's crimes should be public knowledge. Other families deserve to know what he did. Agent Martinez gathered his materials and prepared to leave, but turned back toward our diminished family gathering with unexpected kindness. Recovery from systematic manipulation and criminal abuse takes time and professional help. Federal victim services include counseling for family members who've experienced psychological abuse. I'd recommend that all of you consider therapy to process what you've learned tonight. As the front door closed behind the federal agents, we were left alone with the wreckage of our family's carefully constructed facade. Christmas decorations that had seemed festive hours earlier now felt grotesquely inappropriate. But something had changed in the room's atmosphere. Harold's oppressive presence was gone, replaced by the tentative possibility of honest relationships built on truth rather than manipulation. Jake began clearing legal documents from the dinner table, organizing evidence folders with careful precision. We should probably cancel the rest of the holiday celebrations. I don't think anyone feels much like celebrating right now. Actually, Grandmother Rose said slowly, I think we should have Christmas tomorrow exactly as planned. Not to celebrate, but to begin healing. To start learning how to be a family without fear. Barbara nodded through her tears. She's right. We need to learn how to be together without Harold's manipulation controlling every interaction. Tomorrow can be the first day of our recovery. The evening had destroyed our family's reputation, exposed decades of criminal behavior, and shattered comfortable illusions about wealth and respectability. But it had also freed us from the psychological prison Harold had built around our relationships. For the first time in years, we could be honest with each other without fear of manipulation, blackmail, or retaliation. The price of that freedom was steep, but the alternative would have been continued complicity in criminal behavior. As we finally began clearing the dinner table, I realized that this Christmas Eve had given us an unexpected gift, the truth. Painful, devastating, but ultimately liberating truth that would allow us to build genuine relationships on foundations of integrity rather than intimidation. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the newly established Patterson Family Recovery Fund, watching as Maria Santos signed the deed to her new home. Federal asset forfeiture had transformed Harold's criminal empire into victim restitution, and his former properties were being transferred to the families he'd displaced. This feels like a dream, Maria said softly, holding her 15-month-old daughter Isabella, who giggled and reached for the colorful balloons I'd brought for the occasion. After everything we went through, I never imagined we'd have a real home again. Jake stood beside me in his new role as Director of Ethical Housing Development, having left his investment banking career to build affordable housing on Harold's former properties. 43 families rehoused so far, with 67 more properties in development. Dad's victims are becoming his legacy's beneficiaries. The transformation had been remarkable, but not without pain. Federal sentencing had given Harold 22 years in prison, and he'd written letters of apology to every displaced family. Some had forgiven him, others hadn't, and I'd helped facilitate healing conversations when families chose to engage. Barbara emerged from her therapy session in the building's counseling center, her face showing the peace that comes from facing difficult truths. Dr. Rodriguez says I'm making good progress on boundary setting and decision-making independence. 24 years of psychological abuse doesn't heal overnight, but I'm learning to trust my own judgment again. Her transformation had been the most remarkable. The fearful, compliant woman who'd enabled Harold's crimes had evolved into an advocate for domestic abuse survivors. She now ran support groups for families of white-collar criminals, helping others navigate the shame and isolation that accompanies criminal exposure. How's the shelter development coming along? I asked, referring to her latest project, converting one of Harold's mansions into transitional housing for abuse survivors. 16 bedrooms, commercial kitchen, childcare facilities, and counseling offices. Grand opening next month, with services provided by women who've recovered from similar situations. Pride glowed in her voice. the satisfaction of meaningful work replacing the hollow pursuit of social status. Uncle Tim entered the conference room carrying financial reports that showed steady progress in victim restitution. Asset recovery hit $12.8 million this quarter. Every displaced family will receive full compensation for moving costs, temporary housing expenses, and emotional damages within 18 months. His own financial recovery had been slower but steady. Losing 60% of his wealth had forced lifestyle changes, but honest work rebuilding his investment portfolio on legitimate foundations provided satisfaction that Harold's criminal profits never had. Aunt Carol followed him carrying photo albums filled with pictures from the volunteer work she'd organized. 22 families helped with moving expenses this month, 14 children enrolled in educational support programs, 8 elderly residents connected with senior services. Our extended family's volunteer hours total over 400 per month. Even adversity had created positive change. The family members who'd been unwitting beneficiaries of criminal proceeds now devoted significant time and resources to community service. Guilt had transformed into productive action. Derek and Brandon arrived together, both changed by their sophomore year experiences at community college, rather than expensive private universities. Finals went great, Derek announced. Dean's List both semesters, and I got accepted to transfer to state for social work next year. Engineering program for me, Brandon added. I want to design sustainable housing for low-income communities. Figured I should use my privilege to build things instead of tear them down. Their generation's response to family scandal had been inspiring. Rather than retreating into denial or shame, they'd embraced social responsibility and dedicated themselves to constructive careers. Ashley bounded in from her internship at Legal Aid, her social media following, now devoted to housing justice advocacy, rather than lifestyle content. The legislative hearing went amazing. 3 new bills introduced for tenant protection, stronger oversight of federal housing grants, and criminal penalties for systematic displacement. Turns out viral videos can actually change policy when they document real injustice. Grandmother Rose arrived last, walking slowly but steadily with her new caregiver. At 86, she'd become the moral center of our family's reconstruction. "How are our newest residents settling in?" she asked, referring to the families who'd moved into renovated properties that week. "Fine. David Chen's father loves the community garden," I reported. "He's teaching other residents traditional Chinese medicinal herbs. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman Harold evicted, is leading a knitting circle for the children. And the Rodriguez family opened a small restaurant that employs 3 other formerly displaced residents." The healing had spread beyond our immediate family into genuine community restoration. Harold's victims had become leaders in creating supportive networks for vulnerable populations. My own work had evolved beyond traditional social services. The Patterson Family Recovery Fund employed 15 full-time staff members, all focused on systematic support for displacement recovery. We'd learned that individual charity wasn't enough. Sustainable change required addressing the structural problems that allowed predatory development in the first place. "Any word from Dad lately?" Jake asked quietly, referring to the letters Harold occasionally sent from federal prison. "Same themes?" I replied, pulling his most recent letter from my folder. Remorse, requests for family contact, and promises of changed behavior when he's released. "His parole hearing isn't for 12 years, but he wants us to know he's participating in therapy and educational programs." "How? Do you believe he's genuinely changed?" Barbara asked her question, reflecting the complexity of forgiving someone who'd caused systematic harm. "I believe he's facing consequences that might lead to change," I answered carefully. "But forgiveness and trust are different things. We can forgive his past behavior without exposing ourselves to future manipulation." The distinction had become crucial for our family's healing. Forgiveness didn't require forgetting trusting or enabling continued harmful behavior. It meant releasing the anger and resentment that poisoned our own recovery while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Agent Martinez joined us for our monthly progress review, his presence, now representing support rather than investigation. Federal oversight of the restitution program ends next year, but the Patterson Foundation will continue operating independently. This model is being studied for replication in other white-collar crime cases. Our tragedy had become a template for transforming criminal proceeds into community healing. Other families affected by financial crimes were learning from our experience, discovering that systematic support worked better than individual settlements. What's the most important lesson you've learned from this experience? Agent Martinez asked a question he'd been researching for a federal report on victim-centered justice. I considered his question carefully, thinking about the journey from that explosive Christmas dinner to today's celebration of community restoration. He quote, "The most important lesson is that real family strength comes from facing difficult truths together, choosing justice over convenience, and building relationships on respect rather than control." I replied, "Blood doesn't determine family. Shared values and mutual support create real bonds." Jake nodded emphatically. Dad was biologically our father, but he chose to become our oppressor through his actions. Sean chose to become our leader by standing up for what was right, even when it was painful for everyone. Barbara wiped away tears that represented healing rather than shame. I learned that fear makes you complicit in evil, but courage creates opportunities for redemption. It's never too late to choose integrity over security. Grandmother Rose spoke with the wisdom of 86 years and recent hard-earned understanding. I learned that protecting family reputation isn't the same as protecting family well-being. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is expose harmful behavior, even when it causes temporary pain. The extended family members shared their own insights about privilege responsibility and the difference between inherited wealth and earned respect. Their transformation from unwitting beneficiaries of crime to active advocates for justice had been profound. As our meeting concluded and families departed for evening activities, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that Christmas Eve confrontation. Harold's empire was gone, but something better had taken its place, a community built on honesty, accountability, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The financial cost had been significant. We'd lost the mansion, the luxury cars, the private school educations, the social status that came with wealth. But we'd gained something more valuable, the ability to sleep peacefully, to look at ourselves in mirrors without shame, to build relationships without fear of manipulation. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Thompson, the homeless veteran I'd mentioned during that Christmas dinner. He was 6 months clean employed as a counselor in our housing program and getting married next month. "Thanks for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself," his text read. "Your family's foundation gave me a second chance at life." Those messages arrive daily now from families who'd been helped, volunteers who'd found purpose, and community members who'd discovered that healing was possible even after systematic harm. The sun set behind the building where we'd spent the day celebrating recovery and planning future assistance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help families displaced by predatory development, new chances to build community connections that transcended individual trauma. But tonight, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from choosing difficult integrity over convenient complicity. The courage to stand up during that Christmas dinner had cost us everything we thought we valued, and given us everything that actually mattered. Harold had called me the biggest disgrace to our family, but I'd learned that real disgrace comes from enabling harm rather than exposing it. Standing up for justice, even when it fractures family relationships, represents the highest form of love, the willingness to accept temporary pain in service of long-term healing. The Patterson family's story had become a testament to the possibility of redemption, the power of systematic accountability, and the truth that authentic family bonds grow stronger when built on honesty rather than fear. Some stories end with revenge, others with forgiveness, but ours ended with something more powerful: transformation. Harold's crimes had been exposed, his victims had been compensated, and his family had learned to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than intimidation. The biggest disgrace would have been remaining silent while families suffered for our comfort. Instead, that Christmas Eve confrontation had become the beginning of genuine healing, honest relationships, and community restoration that would continue long after the legal proceedings concluded. What would you have done in my situation that Christmas Eve? When family loyalty conflicts with moral responsibility, which choice takes more courage? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about finding courage in difficult family situations, and share it with anyone who might need to know that standing up for what's right is always worth the temporary cost. Thank you for joining me on this journey of family healing and community restoration. Remember, the strongest families are built on truth, not secrets. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable harmful behavior. Until next time, choose courage over comfort and never underestimate the power of one person's decision to do what's right.